So my name is John Nall. I'm with Appzion, as Paul had mentioned. Thank you to the area for allowing me to speak at the podium today. So Appzion is an advisory services. We're a workforce mobilization company, and we help companies like yourselves identify the ideal solutions. And that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. Next slide, please. Right, so identifying the ideal solutions in your enterprise really comes down to understanding, what's a good use for augmented reality technology. So where we found some really great opportunities is with 3D design visualization, complex or highly visible variable hands-on tasks, knowledge capture and sharing, so training and retraining in the field. Anytime you have a distributed or transient workforce, of course, complex processes and tasks that are in the field. And of course, anywhere there's a high compliance situation where you want to make sure that the operators are following the step-by-step instructions to the letter. Next slide, please. So the most important thing is you want to make sure that the data that you're presenting to the field worker is actionable in the field. So what we call the synergy is basically location, data, and the object that's out in the field. So as you're identifying your ideal solutions and starting to brainstorm, and what we found with the clients that we work with, there's no shortage of ideas that actually come out of any given session. So much exuberance, in fact, that we actually have to attenuate that a little bit and kind of come down to what is the ideal solution. So what you want to do is once you've kind of bubbled down, 2 or 3 ideal solutions, really what you need to do is go out into the field and follow the worker, right? So oftentimes if you've done enterprise productivity or process optimization, you go to your standard operating procedures and you say, this is how it's supposed to be done, and then you start your workflow, and then you find out in the middle of it that that's not really how the work gets done. In this case, you really need to follow the workers out in the field, document what they're doing, look at what they're interacting with, and use that as input and analysis when you're going back in to identify, is this a procedure that's logical to do? Because it might be, something you want to do, but it might be the technology's not quite there yet in the wearable, or it might be just so complex to actually enable that there's not really a return on the investment at this time. And then, of course, the other component is storyboarding. So storyboarding is not something that normal business analysts do in corporate environment. Storyboarding is something that normally the marketing department does, or people in the movie industry. But in this case, you want to storyboard what the interactions are going to be that are basically in the field of view of that operator. And you can do that in a variety of ways. We like to use PowerPoints or Google Slides. And as you storyboard through that, you can kind of see, what is the data at that given time that you want to display to that user. And it helps you think about, where that user is in context in the field, what they're seeing at the time, and how you're going to get that data to them at that time, right? And most importantly, you want to focus on the simple and practical, and keep the other ideas in the hopper for down the road. Next slide, please. Right. So as I said, documenting the process is different. Keep that in mind. And then the most important thing is where do you find the content? So, we see all of these wonderful examples here and on videos, YouTube, everywhere. But the most important thing is all that 3D stuff, it may or may not exist. And there's a lot of effort that goes into creating that 3D content. So you may not actually have that 3D content, or maybe if it's a device, maybe the manufacturer has the 3D content, maybe they don't. So that's one of the things that you have to keep in mind, is that you may have to create that 3D content, and that actually adds time, and effort into what you're trying to accomplish. So look to see if you have the 3D content. Look at your work instructions. Go back and look at the notes that you took following the worker. Look to your systems of record, right? So if I'm a facilities management personnel and I'm out there working on HVAC control systems, like for this venue, there's probably a control system in the background that's actually making all of the temperature control. Some of those control systems have open APIs where we can connect to them and actually put that operational data in front of the user. Some don't. So you need to go and, and look at these systems that you probably haven't traditionally looked at. You may actually look at your work order system. Maybe it has the connectivity, maybe it doesn't. And then again, the operator's experience. So you want to get the most experienced operator that is out there to follow and make sure that they're doing it and they've got the most optimized process that they found works for them. Next slide, please. So now that you've identified, what is the right scenario, you've done your storyboarding, you've figured out where the data is or where the data gaps are or the content gaps are, now you have to figure out, so what are we going to do? Are we going to build or are we going to buy? Right? So on the floor today, you're going to see a lot of examples of frameworks. You're going to see a lot of examples of, basically the core code, like of Euphoria. A framework was already mentioned, like Scope AR is actually a framework that actually incorporates Euphoria inside of it. So depending on what you want to do, you want to figure out, do I want to start with something and write it all from scratch because we're unique? Do we want to use a framework out there? Do we want to do even something smaller just to get a proof of value out the door and into the field workers' hands to understand, what their feedback is? The other thing you want to keep in mind is hardware right now is ephemeral, as I call it, right? So on a very quick basis, like I would say within 12 months, the hardware that we see today is going to be upgraded significantly out there. So you don't want to go off and buy, 2 dozen HoloLenses and 3 dozen XYZ because it's going to be obsolete in a very short amount of time. But you should buy one of every one device if it fits your budget. And the reason is because they all have benefits and trade-offs. And as we're trying to understand which technology is the best fit for your scenario in the field, you have to think about, operating conditions, battery life. Does the operator have gloves or not? Is it a noisy environment? Can he talk to it? Maybe he can, maybe he can't. Also, you have to think about what your IT can support eventually. A lot of these devices run on Android. Now the HoloLens runs on Windows 10. Some of them run on their own framework completely. So you have to be, mindful of that. Also, if there's any requirements like OSHA and safety, right? So you have to think about, even if I'm doing this today, can we actually, put this out in production? Maybe not. Maybe because it doesn't meet the safety requirements at this time. So you want to make sure that you can at least get the feedback from the operators in these kind of semi-controlled scenarios and actually use this experience to basically build your capabilities and basically learn and train your workforce along the way. What I didn't mention is you can do all of this on your tablets as well. So you can actually kind of rough out the concepts on a tablet or the phone that they may already have. So that will also help reduce, your hardware investment. But it's important to make sure that you know that when the person is out there in the field, it's not very convenient for them to hold the tablet up and then put it down and hold it up to try to do a work procedure. That's why we find the wearable so compelling. Next slide. Don't forget cybersecurity. So we're adding these devices to the network. They're all neat and cool and new, but they're Android and Windows devices, and they're just another endpoint on your network that could be hacked. Or it's one of these, Fitbits or a smartwatch, right? So all these are endpoints that we're adding to the network to enable these scenarios. We have to be mindful of security. So you should bring in and at least consult or advise your IT security team that you're doing this, that you're going to do this pilot, because you may actually be doing this without IT involvement, because generally very new technology like this, IT is not generally an early adopter on this, but you should keep them informed to make sure that they're along for the process so that they can make sure that. So we always talk about security and make sure that the endpoints are secure. Next slide, please. And then, of course, support. So you've made these scenarios, they're out there using it, but now the enhancements are starting to come. So again, you have to go back into your internal IT and identify, was there someone along that's actually going to step up and learn this new technology that's not traditional in an IT shop? Or are you going to have your, the person who helped implement this for you, stay with you through, some longer engagement to do small enhancements and work with you to do that feedback and run these, iterations as you make it better over time. And then you also have to think about the wearables now and in the future, right? So you have hardware maintenance, right? So you have these devices, they get upgraded, they have updates. You have to apply those updates like your cell phone or your PC. Of course, content deployment to scale. So if we only have 2 or 3 of these devices running around, it's really easy for you to do that. But as you scale them out, 30, 40, 50 more, eventually, you have to think about how you're going to sync these new devices so that if you make an application, you know, how do you proliferate those all to the operators out there? And if you have like step-by-step instructions, you know, how do you not lose tasks that might be in the middle of a task when you actually do that deployment? So you have to keep that in mind. And then, of course, training and support, right? These are new technologies, the hardware and the software, but most of the hardware, so you have to understand, you know, how do you operate it? There is a little bit of a science project, as I call it, to this, to these activities right now. So you have to be able to identify an individual, if it's not a services company like us, that's kind of like an early adopter and kind of likes to tinker with stuff. I call it like the AV guy. So you need that guy that can kind of help support, and if something happens, you know, he can kind of like figure it out on the fly and get the workers out there so that they have a great experience. Next slide, please. So in summary, you know, we want to make sure that you are mindful of like, what are the ideal scenarios? Again, that's like that 3D visualization, step-by-step instructions, you know, tasks that, you know, have compliance attached to them. Of course, then scenario identification, you know, walking the line, as I call it, to observe how that operator is doing that, take notes, take pictures. And then, of course, the mapping techniques, you know, the storyboarding. So, you know, where do you find the content? And again, think about the hardware and software. Do you build it, or do you buy it, or do you do both? Maybe in the early phases you build it because you can actually get something out there real quick, but you know everything you're doing is kind of like disposable. So what you get is the lessons learned, but you know it's actually not to scale, and that's okay. Because what's really important right now is to get the feedback and get the, you know, of the actual end users, those field workers, so that you can actually refine the software so that it has the best experience for the whole team. Always remember security, security, security. Of course, hardware selection, what's the right one? Maybe you want to try different versions to see which has got the best, you know, fit for the scenario or for what your IT department can support. And then again, after you've deployed it, you know, how are you going to maintain your investment over time? Last slide, please. So again, my name is John Nall. I'm with Appzion, Workforce Mobilization. We are a systems integration company. We have a cybersecurity practice for the endpoints as we put these out there. And we focus on using augmented and virtual reality in the enterprise. And our area of expertise is in facilities management, commercial bakeries, logistics companies, things like this. So we can also play in other areas like, you know, aerospace and stuff, but we know the big boys are over there. So we're helping regular enterprise start to adopt this. Also architects. So we also have a practice that actually takes 3D models and visualizes that for design and pre-construction, and also the facilities management team after. So again, visit us. We actually have a booth here, booth 523. We're on the crossroads of AR and VR, so please make a point to give us your time. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, John. We have time for just 1 or 2 questions if anyone has a question.
This was great perspective. Thank you very much. What do you see as the keys to success thinking about getting from pilot to deployment at scale?
So I think the limiting factor right now is the hardware. You know, so if you're out there today, make sure you go to every booth you can and try all the devices, no matter if they're binocular or monocular, just so you have that feel of like what's right for you. So the hardware, we focus on the binocular see-through because we want that holographic experience for our workers, and we find that actually be pleasure, you know, the most intuitive for them. But it's heavy, battery life is short, and they're fragile. Right? So imagine $3,000 HoloLens and you tilt your head, maybe you didn't tighten it too hard, now it's $3,000 cracked on the floor. So it's, you know, so they're not that robust yet. Also, safety, right? So you have to think about something like DACR, you know, they're working on making that helmet, you know, for industrial cases, you know, safety certified, it already has the capability of the full day's battery, hot swappable, all of that. but the cost of that is, you know, many thousands of dollars. So you're not going to buy a lot of them now. Yes?
Thanks. Question about content.
Yes.
Of the customers that you've worked with, what proportion of them need some help generating new content, and what proportion have already that content available for them to use?
All of them. So it depends. So if they're just presenting operational data in their field of view, so you may have seen some of the pictures like the one that had the electrical panels, there's no content, right? So that content is very easy to generate. They don't have that content like in the way that we need to develop that. However, to create it is very simple. But the other one where you have these animations where you're actually doing the step-by-step procedure, where you see the item in 3D, it's likely they don't have that content because they've never needed it before. Unless they're a larger organization, so maybe, you know, the car companies might, right? So in any organization that is a very robust, you know, training and development organization may have that content. But the organizations that we work with are a little bit, they don't have that kind of organization in their enterprise. So we have to either create that content or find it if it might be out there from the manufacturer. If we're working with architects, then we actually work with the ones that work with 3D content from the start, which might be CAD, Revit, or Rhino. And that's automatically 3D, and you can take that in and do the augmentations from there.
Great. Thank you, John.
Great. Thank you.